Imagine, for a moment, the most powerful corporation in the world today. Maybe you're thinking of Apple, with its sleek devices in every pocket. Maybe you're thinking of Amazon, with its logistics network that spans the globe. Or perhaps Google, which knows more about you than you know about yourself. Now, try to imagine if Amazon didn't just have delivery drones, but battleships. Imagine if Google didn't just have security guards, but a standing army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army at the time. Imagine if Apple didn't just pay taxes, but collected them, ruling over hundreds of millions of people with the power of life and death. It sounds like a dystopian science fiction movie, doesn't it? A cyberpunk nightmare where corporations have replaced governments. But here's the terrifying truth. This has already happened. This isn't fiction. This is history. We're talking about the Honourable East India Company. They didn't just influence politics. They were the politics. They didn't just lobby governments. They conquered nations. They were the first corporate overlords, the original too-big-to-fail entity, and the godfathers of modern capitalism. They engineered the drug trade on a continental scale. They starved millions for profit, and they reshaped the map of the world forever. Before Rockefeller, before Vanderbilt, before Jeff Bezos, there was the John Company, and their story is the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when the pursuit of profit is completely unchained from morality. Welcome to the dark, bloody, and incredibly profitable history of the East India Company. To understand how a company became a conqueror, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to travel back to London in the year 1600. But forget the London you see in postcards today. This wasn't a city of clean streets and polite society. This was a city of mud, smoke, and ambition. England was a second-rate power, living in the shadow of the mighty Spanish Empire and the wealthy Portuguese. But the merchants of London were hungry. They were smelling something in the air, something more valuable than gold. Spices. In the 16th and 17th centuries, spices like nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and pepper were the oil of their day. They weren't just for cooking. They were status symbols, medicines, and preservatives. A pocketful of nutmeg could buy you a house in London. The profit margins were insane, sometimes reaching thousands of %. But there was a problem. The spice trade was locked down tight by the Portuguese and the Dutch. The Dutch, in particular, were ruthless. They controlled the Spice Islands in what is now Indonesia. If you were an English merchant and you tried to sail there, you risked being blown out of the water, or worse, captured and tortured. But the risk was worth it. The potential rewards were so high that men were willing to sail into the unknown, facing scurvy, storms, and pirates, just for a chance to bring back a hull full of peppercorns. However, individual merchants had a problem. Fitting out a ship for a voyage to the East Indies cost a fortune. If that ship sank, or if it was captured by pirates, the merchant would be ruined. Bankruptcy in those days didn't mean a restructuring plan. It often meant debtor's prison. The risk was simply too high for one person to bear alone. So, on a cold New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1600, a group of 218 merchants gathered. They had a radical idea. An idea that would change the world just as much as the steam engine or the internet. They decided to pool their money. They approached Queen Elizabeth I with a petition. They asked for a royal charter. This charter would give them a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. In exchange, the crown would get a cut of the profits. Queen Elizabeth, shrewd and always in need of money, agreed. Thus, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies was born. This was the birth of the Joint Stock Company. Think about the genius of this structure. Instead of one person owning one ship, hundreds of people bought shares in the company. If one ship sank, you didn't lose everything. You just lost a small percentage of your investment. It democratized risk. It allowed for the accumulation of massive amounts of capital, far more than any king or queen could raise on their own. It was a financial nuclear weapon. But in 1600, the East India Company wasn't yet a monster. It was a scrappy underdog. Their first voyages were disasters. They tried to go to the Spice Islands to trade for nutmeg, but the Dutch were waiting for them. The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, was richer, stronger, and meaner. They slaughtered English merchants. They blocked English ships. They humiliated the British at every turn. Beaten and bruised, the East India Company had to look for a plan B. They couldn't compete with the Dutch in Indonesia. So, they looked specifically at a vast triangular landmass to the west. A place of unimaginable wealth, legendary textiles, and booming industry. They looked at India. It is important to destroy a common myth right now. When we think of the British in India, we often think of arrogant colonial masters in white pith helmets ordering around servants. But that is the end of the story. The beginning was very, very different. When the first English ships arrived on the coast of India in the early 1600s, they weren't conquerors. They were essentially beggars. India, at that time, was ruled by the Mughal Empire. The Mughals were a superpower. Under emperors like Akbar the Great and later Jahangir, India accounted for 25% of the entire world's GDP. To put that in perspective, the United States today accounts for about 24%. Mughal India was the economic engine of the world. Their textiles were the finest. Their cities were the richest. And their armies were massive. Compared to the Mughals, the British were essentially barbarians from a rainy, insignificant island. When the East India Company's ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe, arrived at the court of Emperor Jahangir in 1615, he was desperate. He wasn't demanding territory. He was begging for a firman, a royal permit, just to build a small factory, just to trade. Emperor Jahangir was amused. He looked at these rough Englishmen with their wool coats and bad manners, and he saw them as a curiosity. He granted them the permit, mostly because he didn't see them as a threat. Why would a tiger worry about a mosquito? This was the company's foothold. They established their first factory in Surat. And here's where the corporate nature of the East India Company became its greatest strength. Unlike the Portuguese, who tried to convert everyone to Christianity, or the Spanish, who wanted to conquer land for the glory of the king, the East India Company only cared about one thing: the balance sheet. They were creating a corporation, not a crusade. They told their agents in India, do not try to convert the locals. Do not get involved in local politics. Just make money. And make money they did. They realized that while they couldn't get nutmeg, they could get cotton. Indian cotton textiles were light, colorful, and washable. In England, people were wearing heavy, itchy wool. When Indian cotton hit the streets of London, it was a fashion revolution. It was like the introduction of the iPhone. Everyone had to have it. Calico, chintz, muslin, these fabrics flew off the shelves. The company's profits soared. They expanded. They built trading posts in Madras, Bombay, and a swampy village that would later become the great city of Calcutta. For the first 50 years, the East India Company was the model of a peaceful trading corporation. They respected local laws because they had to. They bribed local officials because that was the cost of doing business. They were guests in the house of the Mughal emperor. But corporations are like living organisms. They have an instinct to grow. And when a corporation grows large enough, it starts to chafe against the rules. It starts to wonder, why are we paying taxes to these local rulers? Why are we asking for permission? Two things happened in the early 18th century that would turn this trading company into a predator. First, the Mughal Empire began to fracture. After the death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707, the central authority in Delhi weakened. Regional governors, known as Nawabs, started acting like independent kings. India became a patchwork of warring states. Chaos is bad for ordinary people, but chaos is a ladder for a ruthless corporation. Second, the French arrived. The French East India Company appeared on the scene, and they weren't just interested in trade. They wanted influence. The British realized that if they didn't militarize, the French would push them out. And so, the transformation began. The warehouses, which were meant to store cotton and opium, started to look a lot like forts. The security guards, originally hired just to protect the goods from thieves, started to be trained in European military tactics. They hired local Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, and gave them redcoats and muskets. The merchant was putting on armor. The ledger book was being replaced by the sword. Let's zoom in on the moment the mask fell off. The year is 1756. The place is Bengal. Bengal was the jewel of India. It was incredibly fertile, rich in textile production, and wealthy beyond belief. The ruler of Bengal was a young, hot-headed Nawab named Siraj-ud-Dawla. He looked at the British in Calcutta and he didn't like what he saw. He saw them strengthening the fortifications of Fort William without his permission. He saw them abusing their trade privileges to avoid paying taxes. Siraj-ud-Dawla decided to teach the company a lesson. He marched his army to Calcutta and crushed the British defenses. He captured the city. It was a humiliation for the East India Company. In London, the shareholders were furious. But in Madras, a company officer named Robert Clive was enraged. Robert Clive is one of the most controversial figures in history. To the Victorians, he was a hero. To us, he looks like a sociopath. He was a brilliant military tactician, but he was also corrupt, ruthless, and addicted to opium. He was the perfect man for the East India Company. Clive gathered an army, but it wasn't a national army. It was a corporate mercenary force. He sailed to Bengal to retake Calcutta. But Clive knew that he couldn't defeat the Nawab's massive army in a fair fight. The Nawab had 50,000 men and heavy artillery. Clive had 3,000 men. So, Clive did what any unscrupulous CEO would do. He didn't just fight on the battlefield. He fought in the back room. He opened the corporate checkbook. He found a man named Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar was the Nawab's top general. He was ambitious, and he was purchasable. Clive made him a deal. Stand down your troops during the battle. Betray your master. And when we win, we will make you the Nawab of Bengal. The deal was struck. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is often called a battle, but it was really a transaction. When the fighting started, Mir Jafar took his massive portion of the army and simply stood there, watching. Siraj-ud-Dawla was betrayed, defeated, and later executed. Robert Clive installed Mir Jafar as the puppet ruler of Bengal. But there was a catch. The East India Company presented Mir Jafar with a bill, a massive bill for services rendered. They demanded millions of pounds in compensation. They emptied the treasury of Bengal. They loaded boats with gold, silver, and jewels and sent them down the river to Calcutta. Robert Clive personally took a fortune that would make him the richest man in Europe. He later told a parliamentary committee, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." But the real prize wasn't the gold in the treasury. It was the Diwani. A few years later, in 1765, after defeating another alliance of Indian rulers, the East India Company forced the weakened Mughal emperor to sign a treaty. But this wasn't a trade treaty. They demanded the Diwani of Bengal. This is the turning point. This is the moment the world changed. The Diwani was the right to collect taxes. Think about that. A private corporation headquartered in a small building in London, owned by private shareholders, was granted the legal right to collect taxes from 20 million people in Bengal. They were no longer merchants selling goods. They were now the government. But they were a government with no responsibility to the people, a government that existed solely to maximize profit. Imagine if Amazon bought the IRS and decided that all your taxes now go directly to Jeff Bezos' bank account. And in exchange, they provide nothing. No roads, no schools, no hospitals, just tax collection enforcement. That is exactly what happened to Bengal. The East India Company outsourced the tax collection to ruthless agents who squeezed the peasants for every last grain of rice. They raised taxes even when the harvest failed. They didn't care if the people starved, as long as the revenue ships arrived in London on time. The result was inevitable, and it was horrific. But we'll get to the horror in a moment. First, we need to understand the scale of the looting. This wasn't just stealing money. It was deindustrialization. Before the British, Bengal was a manufacturing hub. The company realized that rather than buying textiles, they could just squeeze the weavers. They forced weavers to sell only to the company at prices below the cost of production. They cut off the thumbs of weavers who tried to sell to others. They systematically dismantled the Bengali textile industry so that it wouldn't compete with the rising factories in England. India went from being an exporter of finished goods to an exporter of raw materials and an importer of British goods. It was the first great transfer of wealth from east to west. But the shareholders in London were happy. The stock price was booming. Dividends were high. Gentlemen in London clubs toasted to the success of John Company. They didn't see the starving faces in Bengal. They only saw the numbers in the ledger. And the numbers looked good. Until the bubble burst. Because you cannot loot a country forever without consequences. While the champagne corks were popping in London, a silence was falling over Bengal. It was the silence of death. In 1769, the rains failed. The crops withered in the fields. A drought had arrived. Now, droughts happen. They are a part of nature. But a famine is often man-made. Under the old Mughal rulers, when a drought happened, the taxes were lowered. The granaries were opened. The rulers knew that dead peasants couldn't harvest rice next year. But the East India Company didn't think in years. They thought in quarters. They thought in immediate returns for shareholders. When the drought hit, the company didn't lower taxes. Incredibly, in some areas, they actually raised them by 10% to make up for the lost revenue. They strictly enforced tax collection. Agents of the company confiscated the little food the farmers had left to sell for profit. They hoarded grain in warehouses while people dropped dead outside the gates. The result was the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. It is estimated that 10 million people died. 10 million. That was 1/3 of the population of Bengal. Eyewitness accounts from that time are the stuff of nightmares. They describe rivers clogged with corpses because there was no one left to bury them. They describe fields littered with skeletons. They describe parents selling their children for a handful of rice. And then finding no rice, starving to death anyway. But here is the most chilling statistic. During the height of the famine, while 10 million people were perishing, the East India Company's tax revenue from Bengal actually increased. They had squeezed blood from a stone. When news of the famine reached London, there was a brief scandal. But the company's PR machine went to work. They blamed the local officials. They blamed the weather. They blamed the laziness of the natives. They did everything except take responsibility. However, there is a concept in economics called the bubble. You can inflate stock prices with hype and looting for a while, but eventually, reality catches up. By 1772, the East India Company was in trouble. The famine had killed their workforce. The looting had drained the local economy so dry that there was nothing left to steal. The company was drowning in debt. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. And this leads us to a moment that will sound very familiar to modern ears. The East India Company went to the British government and said, "We are too big to fail." They argued that if they collapsed, the entire British economy would collapse with them. They held the nation hostage. And the government blinked. They passed the Tea Act of 1773. This was essentially the world's first massive corporate bailout. The government gave the company a loan of £1.4 million and gave them special privileges to sell their surplus tea. But this bailout had a side effect that nobody saw coming. A side effect that would cost Britain an entire continent. The East India Company had warehouses in London overflowing with unsold tea. As part of the government bailout, they were given the right to dump this tea on the American colonies, bypassing local American merchants and undercutting the price. They thought the Americans would be happy. Cheaper tea. Right. Who doesn't love a discount? But the American colonists didn't see it that way. They saw a government-backed monopoly coming to crush their local businesses. They saw tyranny. They saw taxation without representation. On December 16th, 1773, a group of colonists in Boston, disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 East India Company ships: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. They smashed open 342 chests of tea and threw them into the harbor. This was the Boston Tea Party. Think about the irony. The flag of the East India Company, with its red and white horizontal stripes and a Union Jack in the corner, looks suspiciously like the future American flag. So, the company lost America. But they still had India, and they had a new problem. The bailout money was running out. They needed a new source of massive profit to pay back their debts and keep the shareholders happy. Cotton was good, but the market was saturated. They needed a product with infinite demand. A product that customers would keep coming back for, no matter the cost. They found it: opium. China was the other economic superpower of the East. For centuries, Europe had been obsessed with Chinese goods like tea, silk, and porcelain. The British bought millions of pounds of Chinese tea every year. But China didn't want British wool or Indian cotton. The Emperor of China famously said, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance." China only accepted one thing in payment: silver. This was a disaster for the British. They were bleeding silver to pay for tea. The trade imbalance was bankrupting them. The East India Company needed to find something, anything, that the Chinese people would buy. They discovered that while the Chinese government didn't want British goods, the Chinese people could be tempted by Indian opium. Opium had been used medicinally in China for a long time, but recreational smoking was illegal. The East India Company saw a market. They decided to become the world's largest drug cartel. They conquered the poppy-growing regions of India, specifically Bengal and Bihar. They established a total monopoly on opium production. It was industrial-scale agriculture dedicated to narcotics. Here is how the scheme worked. It was legally tricky because opium was illegal in China. The East India Company, being a respectable British entity, couldn't just sail drug ships into Beijing. So, they created a system of plausible deniability. The company grew the opium and processed it in their factories. Then, they sold it at auction in Calcutta to private traders, who were essentially smugglers. These smugglers, often sailing fast, armed ships called opium clippers, would race to the coast of China. They would meet with corrupt local officials and Chinese criminal gangs to offload the drugs. The smugglers would pay the company in silver. The company would then use that silver to buy tea in Canton to ship back to London. It was a triangle of profit. Indian opium paid for Chinese tea, which fueled the British Empire. The scale of this operation was horrifying. In the late 18th century, they were shipping a few thousand chests a year. By the 1830s, it was 30,000 chests annually. That is millions of pounds of highly addictive opium pouring into China. The social effect on China was devastating. Millions of men, women, and even government officials became addicts. Productivity collapsed. Families were ruined. The flow of silver reversed. Now, silver was draining out of China to pay for the drugs. The Chinese emperor, Dao Guang, decided enough was enough. In 1839, he appointed a tough, incorruptible official named Lin Zexu to stop the trade. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton. He surrounded the foreign factories. He demanded that the British merchants hand over their opium stocks. When they refused, he locked them in. After a standoff, the British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, surrendered over 20,000 chests of opium. Lin Zexu didn't sell it. He didn't steal it. He dug massive trenches on the beach, mixed the opium with lime and salt water, and washed it out to sea. He even wrote a polite letter to Queen Victoria, asking her to stop her subjects from poisoning the Chinese people. The letter was never delivered. To the Chinese, this was a moral act of defending their nation from poison. to the British, and specifically to the East India Company lobby in London. This was theft of private property and an insult to free trade. The company lobbied the British Parliament hard. They argued that British honor had been stained. They demanded compensation. They demanded war. And they got it. The First Opium War began in 1839. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a massacre. The British Navy brought their new secret weapon, the Nemesis. It was an iron-hulled, steam-powered warship. The Chinese junks, made of wood and powered by wind, didn't stand a chance. The Nemesis could sail up rivers against the current and wind, blasting Chinese forts and ships with heavy artillery. The British forces, including East India Company sepoys, captured city after city. They threatened to bombard Nanking. The Chinese emperor had no choice but to surrender. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanking was signed. The Chinese call it the first of the unequal treaties. The terms were humiliating. China had to pay $21 million in reparations, essentially paying for the drugs that were destroyed and the cost of the war to crush them. And crucially, they had to cede a small, rocky island to the British Crown. That island was Hong Kong. The East India Company had done the unthinkable. They had used the military might of Britain to force a sovereign nation to legalize the drug trade. They had turned addiction into a foreign policy. After the war, the opium trade didn't just resume, it exploded. By the 1850s, opium was the world's most valuable single commodity trade. The revenue from opium taxes became the second largest source of income for the British administration in India. The merchant had become a monster. But as the company grew more powerful, it also grew more arrogant. They stopped respecting the customs of the people they ruled. They started to believe in their own invincibility. They thought they could push the people of India as far as they wanted, and there would be no pushback. They were wrong. A storm was gathering in the barracks. A storm that would threaten to burn the company to the ground. By 1857, the East India Company wasn't just a trading firm. It was a leviathan. It ruled over 200 million people. It had its own civil service, its own courts, and most importantly, its own private army. This army was massive, numbering nearly 300,000 men. But here was the fatal flaw. Only about 40,000 of those soldiers were British. The vast majority, over 200,000 of them, were Indians. They were called sepoys. For a long time, the sepoys were loyal. The company paid well, and they paid on time. Being a sepoy was a prestigious job, but trust is a fragile thing. And by the mid-19th century, the British had become dangerously arrogant. They stopped listening. They introduced a policy called the Doctrine of Lapse. It was a legal trick. It stated that if an Indian ruler died without a natural biological heir, their kingdom would not pass to an adopted son, as was the Indian custom. Instead, the kingdom would lapse, meaning it would be seized by the company. Using this rule, the company stole kingdom after kingdom, including Satara, Jhansi, and Nagpur. They were erasing the traditional aristocracy of India. At the same time, Christian missionaries were pouring into the country. They were preaching in the markets, insulting Hindu gods and the Prophet Muhammad. The sepoys began to whisper. They feared that the company had a secret plan to destroy their religions, Hinduism and Islam, and force them all to become Christians. The atmosphere was like a room filled with gasoline. All it needed was a spark. That spark came in the form of a new weapon, the Enfield pattern 1853 rifled musket. This was a state-of-the-art gun, but to load it, a soldier had to bite off the end of a paper cartridge, which contained the gunpowder and the bullet. The cartridge was greased to make it slide into the barrel. A rumor spread through the barracks like wildfire. The grease, the rumor said, was made from a mixture of cow fat and pig fat. For a Hindu, the cow is sacred. To taste cow fat is a sin that could cost them their caste. For a Muslim, the pig is unclean. To taste pig fat is an abomination. Whether the rumor was true or not didn't matter. The soldiers believed it. They saw it as the final proof of the company's plot to defile them. When they refused to use the cartridges, the British officers, blind to the cultural dynamite they were holding, responded with harsh punishments. They humiliated the soldiers. They stripped them of their uniforms and shackled them. On May 10th, 1857, in the garrison town of Meerut, the dam broke. The sepoys mutinied. They killed their British officers. They broke open the jails. And then they marched. They marched to Delhi, the old capital of the Mughal Empire. The Indian Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, had begun. The rebellion spread across northern India with terrifying speed. It wasn't just soldiers. Princes who had lost their lands, peasants who had been taxed into starvation, and landlords who had been humiliated. Everyone rose up. The company was caught completely off guard. The war that followed was savage. It was a war of no mercy. And it produced one of the darkest chapters in British imperial history, the Siege of Cawnpore. Cawnpore was a major company station. When the rebellion hit, the British community there, about 900 people, including soldiers, women, and children, were besieged by a rebel leader named Nana Sahib. They held out for weeks in the scorching heat, with little water and constant bombardment. They were dying of heat stroke and starvation. Finally, Nana Sahib offered them a deal. If they surrendered, they would be given safe passage by boat down the river to Allahabad. The British commander agreed. On June 27th, the survivors marched to the riverbank to board the boats. But as they pushed off, chaos erupted. Shots were fired. The boatmen set the boats on fire. It turned into a slaughter. Most of the men were killed right there in the water. But the women and children, about 120 of them, were captured. They were taken back to Kanpur and imprisoned in a small house called the Bibigar. What happened next is a subject of horror and debate. As British relief forces approached the city, panic set in among the rebels. Orders were given to execute the prisoners. The sepoys refused to shoot women and children. So, butchers from the local market were brought in with knives and cleavers. When the British troops entered Kanpur 2 days later, they found the Bibigar empty of life. But the walls and floor were covered in blood. They found the bodies of the women and children thrown into a nearby dry well. The sight of the well of Kanpur drove the British soldiers into a frenzy of rage. It became a rallying cry. Remember Kanpur was screamed on every battlefield. It justified, in their eyes, a retaliation so brutal that it would be remembered for a century. The British response wasn't a military campaign. It was a punishment. They called it the Devil's Wind. British columns moved across India, burning entire villages to the ground if they suspected anyone there had helped the rebels. They didn't just hang mutineers. They staged public executions designed to terrorize the population. A favored method of execution by the British during this time was called blowing from a gun. A prisoner would be tied to the mouth of a cannon. When the cannon was fired, the body was essentially vaporized. For the victims, this wasn't just death. It was the destruction of the body, which, according to their beliefs, affected their journey in the afterlife. In Delhi, after the British retook the city, the slaughter was indiscriminate. Thousands of civilians were killed in the streets. The looting was systematic. The Mughal Emperor, Bahadur Shah II, an 82-year-old poet who had been reluctant to lead the rebellion, was captured. His sons were executed, and he was exiled to Burma, ending the Mughal dynasty forever. The violence on both sides was extreme. It was a race war, a religious war, and a class war all rolled into one. But the East India Company had superior resources, telegraph lines to coordinate their movements, and the backing of the industrial might of Britain. By 1858, the rebellion was crushed. Peace returned, but it was the peace of the graveyard. But there was another casualty of this war. The East India Company itself. Back in London, the public was horrified. They read the newspaper reports of the massacres and the brutality. They asked a simple question: how did a group of merchants allow this to happen? The British Parliament realized that the experiment was over. You cannot let a private corporation run a country. A corporation's duty is to its shareholders, not to the people. Profit and governance are fundamentally incompatible when the stakes are human lives. On August 2nd, 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. It was a death sentence for the East India Company. The act stripped the company of all its administrative powers, its territories, its armies, and its revenue were transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. The John Company, the monster that had risen from a small office in London to rule the world, was hollowed out. It continued to exist as a small trading tea firm for a few more years, a ghost of its former self. Finally, on June 1st, 1874, the East India Company was formally dissolved. But here is the twist. The company died, but its DNA survived. When the British government took over, they didn't give India back to the Indians. They simply changed the management. To understand the full impact of the East India Company, we cannot just look at the devastated fields of Bengal. We have to look at the manicured lawns of England. In the late 18th century, a new breed of men began to appear in London society. They were British men who had spent 20 or 30 years in India working for the company. They had left as sons of modest merchants or impoverished gentry. They returned as kings. They were called nabobs. This word was a corruption of the Mughal title Nawab, meaning a ruler or governor. But in England, it was used as a slur. It meant a filthy rich upstart. These men brought home fortunes that were mathematically impossible to earn on a salary. A company writer, an entry-level clerk, might earn a salary of only £5 a year. Yet, after 2 decades, he would return with £200,000. How? Through private trade, which is a polite way of saying bribery, embezzlement, and racketeering. When these nabobs returned, they didn't just quietly retire. They bought massive country estates, displacing the old aristocracy. They built palaces that mimicked the architecture they saw in India. They wore diamonds that had once adorned the turbans of princes. Society hated them. The old landed gentry despised them as vulgar. The poor hated them for their arrogance. There was a popular play at the time called The Nabob, which depicted them as corrupt, immoral monsters who had sold their souls for gold. But the most famous Nabob of all was Robert Clive. We met him earlier as the conqueror of Bengal. When Clive returned to England, he was the richest self-made man in Europe. He bought not just one estate, but several. He bought a seat in Parliament. He even bought a peerage, becoming Baron Clive of Plassey. But money couldn't buy peace. Clive was hounded by his enemies. He was investigated by Parliament for corruption. He was addicted to opium to manage the pain of a chronic illness. In 1774, the man who had conquered a subcontinent sat down in his lavish London townhouse and cut his own throat with a penknife. His suicide shocked the nation. It was seen as a moral judgment. Samuel Johnson, the famous writer, said Clive had acquired his fortune by such crimes that his consciousness of them impelled him to cut his own throat. But while Clive was gone, the system he helped build remained. The nabobs realized something crucial. Money is power, but political power protects money. Today, we talk about corporate lobbying as a modern problem. We worry about big tech or big pharma buying influence in Washington. But the East India Company invented the game. By the 1780s, the company wasn't just a business. It was a political machine. The nabobs used their illicit fortunes to buy seats in the House of Commons. At one point, it was estimated that a third of the members of Parliament owned stock in the East India Company. Think about that. 1/3 of the government was financially invested in the success of a single corporation. This meant the company was untouchable. When reformers tried to pass laws to rein in the company's brutality in India, the company's shareholders in Parliament would vote them down. They bought newspapers to print favorable stories. They paid authors to write pamphlets defending their monopoly. They created a revolving door between the corporation and the state. Directors of the company became politicians, and politicians became directors. Does this sound familiar? When the company needed a bailout in 1773, the bailout that led to the Boston Tea Party, they got it because they had effectively captured the state. They argued that they were too big to fail. They argued that the British economy was so entangled with the company that if the company went down, it would take the Bank of England with it. This was the birth of state capture. It wasn't just that the company worked for Britain. In many ways, Britain worked for the company. The Royal Navy protected their ships. The British Army fought their wars. The British taxpayer footed the bill for their bailouts. But the profits went privately to the shareholders. It was the ultimate privatization of profit and socialization of risk. Now, let's play a game of spot the difference. Let's look at the East India Company next to the giants of today. Google, Amazon, Meta, and BlackRock. Obviously, Jeff Bezos doesn't have a private army of 200,000 soldiers that we know of. He doesn't execute competitors with cannons. The violence has been removed. But the structure of power, that is eerily similar. First, let's look at the monopoly. The East India Company wanted to control the entire supply chain. They didn't just want to sell tea. They wanted to own the tea plantations, the ships that carried it, the warehouses that stored it, and the shops that sold it. Look at Amazon today. They don't just sell goods. They own the marketplace, the server farms that run the internet, the logistics network, and increasingly, the delivery fleet. They control the infrastructure of commerce, just as the company controlled the infrastructure of trade in the Indian Ocean. Second, let's look at data and surveillance. The East India Company was obsessed with information. They employed thousands of scribes. They mapped every inch of India. They categorized every caste and religion. Why? Because knowledge is control. To tax a people efficiently, you must know everything about them. Today, the commodity isn't tea or opium. It's data. Google and Meta know more about us than the company could ever dream of. They map our behaviors, our desires, and our fears. The colonialism has moved from the physical land to the digital mind. Third, let's look at the concept of sovereignty. The East India Company issued its own coins. It had its own laws. It signed treaties with kings. It acted like a state. Today, we see tech giants negotiating with nations almost as equals. We see crypto companies trying to create non-state currencies. We see special economic zones where corporations set the rules. The line between corporate policy and public law is blurring again. But perhaps the most terrifying similarity is the algorithms of profit. The East India Company was driven by a simple algorithm: maximize shareholder return. This algorithm didn't care about morality. If selling opium was profitable, they sold opium. If starving peasants increased margins, they starved peasants. It wasn't that the individual directors were all evil men, but the system was designed to be sociopathic. Modern corporations operate on the same operating system. Before we move to the financial wizardry that allowed this to happen, we need to acknowledge one final, uncomfortable truth about the nabobs. They didn't just bring back money. They brought back culture. The nabobs introduced Indian words into the English language that we still use today. Shampoo, pajamas, cash, loot, veranda, jungle, punch, thug. These are all loan words brought back by company men. The company didn't just colonize India. In a strange way, the experience of empire colonized the British mind. It made them harder, colder, and more convinced of their own racial superiority. This ideology of supremacy was necessary to justify the looting. You cannot steal from people if you see them as equals. You have to dehumanize them first. As we prepare to dive into the financial machinery in the next part, keep this in mind. The East India Company wasn't destroyed by an external enemy. It was destroyed by its own success. It became so big, so bloated, and so corrupt that it rotted from the inside out. We have talked about battles, famines, and opium, but there was another battlefield where the East India Company fought, and it was just as ruthless. It was a narrow network of streets and alleyways in London, known as Exchange Alley. If you go to London today, you see glass towers and digital tickers. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, the financial center of the world was a coffee house. Specifically, Jonathan's Coffee House. This was where the stock market was born. Before the East India Company, investing was simple. You bought a cow. You owned a cow. You bought a ship. You owned a ship. But the company introduced something abstract. You weren't buying a ship. You were buying a share. In a permanent, ongoing enterprise. You were buying a piece of paper that promised a share of future profits. This abstraction changed human psychology. It turned business into gambling. In Jonathan's Coffee House, men in powdered wigs shouted prices, bought and sold shares of the East India Company, the South Sea Company, and the Bank of England. They didn't care about the quality of the tea or the suffering of the weavers in Bengal. They only cared about the price movement. The East India Company stock, often just called India stock, was the Bitcoin of its day. It was volatile. It was exciting. It made people rich overnight. But it was also a rigged game. The market in Exchange Alley ran on one thing: information. And in the 18th century, information traveled at the speed of a sailing ship. It took 6 months for news to travel from Calcutta to London. This information lag created the perfect environment for the world's first massive insider trading scheme. Imagine you are a director of the East India Company sitting in London. You receive a private letter from your agent in India. The letter says that Robert Clive has just won the Battle of Plassey and seized the Bengal treasury. This is news that will send the stock price to the moon. But the public doesn't know yet. The official ship carrying the news won't arrive for another week. So, what do? Do you announce it? No. You quietly buy every share you can get your hands on. You tell your friends to buy. You borrow money to buy. Then, when the news breaks, you sell into the frenzy and make a fortune. The directors of the East India Company were masters of this. They manipulated the news cycle. They planted false rumors in newspapers. They would leak fake news about a peace treaty to pump the stock, only to sell right before the news of a new war arrived. This wasn't illegal back then because they were inventing the game. There was no SEC. There were no regulations. It was the Wild West of finance. But the most dangerous financial innovation wasn't just trading shares. It was the dividend. To keep the stock price high, the company had to pay out massive dividends to shareholders every year. It was like a drug. The shareholders became addicted to the 10% or 12% annual returns. But what happens when the profits drop? What happens when a famine kills your taxpayers? A normal company would lower the dividend, but the East India Company wasn't a normal company. It was a Ponzi scheme built on the promise of infinite looting. If they lowered the dividend, the stock price would crash, and the directors, who had borrowed money against their own stock, would be ruined. So, they did something insane. In the midst of the Bengal famine, when revenue was actually falling, they raised the dividend to 12.5%. They paid the shareholders with borrowed money. They cooked the books. They projected future earnings that didn't exist. They kept the party going in London while the foundation was rotting in India. This financial deception led to the first global credit crisis, the crash of 1772. In 1772, the music stopped. A banking partner of the company in London fled to France to escape his debts. Panic spread through Exchange Alley. Banks stopped lending. People rushed to sell their East India Company stock. The price collapsed. The company was exposed. They were broke. They had millions of pounds in tea sitting in warehouses that they couldn't sell. And they owed millions to the Bank of England and the government. By all laws of capitalism, the East India Company should have gone bankrupt. It should have been liquidated. But remember the lesson from earlier. When you are big enough, the rules don't apply to you. The directors went to Parliament. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They demanded a bailout. Their argument was terrifyingly simple. We are the British Empire. If we fail, the tax revenue from India stops. The trade stops. The Bank of England fails. The nation fails. They held a gun to the head of the British economy. Parliament capitulated. They passed the Tea Act of 1773, granting the company a loan of £1.4 million and giving them the monopoly rights to sell tea in America to generate cash. We know how that ended. The Americans threw the tea in the harbor. So, think about this chain of events. A financial bubble in London, caused by insider trading and book cooking, led to a bailout, which led to a monopoly enforcement in Boston, which led to the American Revolution. The birth of the United States was a direct side effect of a corporate bailout gone wrong. But the company survived the crash, and they learned a valuable lesson. War is expensive, but debt is profitable. They began to finance their conquests through military fiscalism. Essentially, they issued bonds. They borrowed money from Indian bankers and British investors to pay for mercenaries to conquer new territories. Then, they used the taxes from those new territories to pay the interest on the debt. It was a cycle of conquest funded by credit. To keep paying the debt, they had to keep conquering. They couldn't stop. If they stopped expanding, the revenue would plateau, and the debt would eat them alive. This turned the company into a perpetual war machine. History is often written by the victors. In the British version of the story, the conquest of India was inevitable. A march of progress. But the truth is, the East India Company was terrified. They didn't just face disorganized mobs. They faced brilliant, technologically advanced enemies who almost pushed them into the sea. The most dangerous of them all was Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore. They called him the Tiger of Mysore. He didn't just wear tiger stripes. He was obsessed with them. His throne was a tiger. His soldiers wore tiger uniforms. He even had a life-sized mechanical organ made in the shape of a tiger devouring a British soldier. When you turned the handle, the tiger roared and the soldier screamed. That artifact is still in a museum in London today, a testament to his hatred for the company. But Tipu wasn't just a symbol. He was a technological innovator. Long before the British, Tipu developed the world's first iron-cased war rockets. In the battles of the 1780s and 1790s, the company soldiers were terrified by these Mysorean rockets raining down on them from the sky. It took 4 brutal wars for the company to finally defeat him. In 1799, at the siege of Seringapatam, Tipu was killed defending his capital. The company soldiers looted his palace. They stripped the jewels from his body. But here is the irony. The British took Tipu's rockets back to England. They reverse-engineered them. These rockets became the basis for the Congreve rocket, which the British later used to bombard Fort McHenry in the United States during the War of 1812. So, when Americans sing about the rocket's red glare in their national anthem, they are unknowingly singing about technology invented by an Indian king. To fight the East India Company, The tentacles of this history touch everything. The looting of Tipu's palace was just a warm-up. The East India Company had an appetite for treasure that couldn't be sated. And there was one prize that they coveted above all others: a diamond. The Koh-i-Noor. In Persian, it means mountain of light. It is one of the largest cut diamonds in the world. Legend says that whoever owns this diamond rules the world, but it also carries a terrible curse. Only God or woman can wear it with impunity. Any man who owns it will know great suffering. For centuries, the diamond passed through the hands of Mughal emperors, Persian warlords, and Afghan kings. Each one suffered a tragic fate: blinded, assassinated, or overthrown. By the mid-19th century, the diamond was in the possession of the Sikh Empire in Punjab. The ruler was Duleep Singh. He was just a boy, 10 years old. The East India Company, ruthless as ever, defeated the Sikh army and forced the young boy king to sign the Treaty of Lahore in 1849. In that treaty, they forced a 10-year-old child to gift the Koh-i-Noor to Queen Victoria. They didn't just steal a rock. They stole a symbol of sovereignty. The diamond was shipped to London, but when it was displayed at the Great Exhibition of 1851, the British public was disappointed. It looked like a dull piece of glass. It wasn't sparkly enough for Victorian tastes. So, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, ordered it to be recut. They shaved off 40% of its weight just to make it shine brighter. This act is perhaps the perfect metaphor for colonialism, taking something ancient and invaluable and grinding it down to make it look pretty for the West. Today, the Koh-i-Noor sits in the front of the Queen Mother's crown in the Tower of London. India, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan have all demanded its return. The British government has always refused. They say it was a legal gift. But can a 10-year-old boy with a gun to his head really give a gift? The Koh-i-Noor remains the ultimate symbol of the East India Company's legacy. Beautiful, priceless, and stolen. But the company stole something even more valuable than diamonds. They stole an entire industry. Remember the tea trade. For centuries, China had a global monopoly on tea. The British were addicted to it, but they hated paying China for it. They wanted to grow their own tea in India, but there was a problem. The best tea plants were in China, and the Chinese guarded their cultivation secrets with their lives. So, in 1848, the East India Company hired a botanist named Robert Fortune. His mission was simple: industrial espionage. Fortune disguised himself as a Chinese mandarin. He shaved the front of his head, wore a ponytail, and learned the language. He traveled deep into the forbidden tea-growing regions of China. It was a dangerous mission. If he had been caught, he would have been executed. But he succeeded. He stole 20,000 tea plants and seedlings. He also recruited expert Chinese tea makers and smuggled them out of the country. He brought them to the Himalayas. to a place called Darjeeling. The stolen plants thrived. The British established massive tea plantations in India, run like military camps. Within a few decades, the Chinese tea industry collapsed. India became the world's leading tea producer. Today, when you drink a cup of English breakfast tea or Earl Grey, you are drinking the result of the greatest corporate theft in history. The British national drink is stolen property. So, did the East India Company ever really die? On paper, yes. It was dissolved on June 1st, 1874. The stock ticker stopped. The flag came down. But look around you. We live in a world that the East India Company built. They created the model of the global supply chain. They pioneered the shareholder-owned corporation. They invented the concept of corporate liability, protecting investors from the crimes of the company. They standardized the English language across the globe. Today, English is the language of business in Mumbai, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Not because of Shakespeare, but because of the company's clerks. But their darkest legacy is the idea that a corporation has no soul. The East India Company proved that a group of good men, fathers, husbands, churchgoers, could come together in a boardroom and make decisions that resulted in the deaths of millions, without any of them feeling personally responsible. They could hide behind the fiduciary duty to shareholders. We see this ghost every day. When a tech company ignores the mental health of teenagers to boost engagement metrics, that is the ghost of the East India Company. When a multinational corporation sues a small country to stop them from passing environmental laws that would hurt profits, that is the ghost of the East India Company. When banks are bailed out by taxpayers after gambling away the economy, repeating the logic of too big to fail, that is the ghost of the East India Company. Larry Fink of BlackRock, the modern titan of finance, recently wrote letters to CEOs talking about corporate purpose and social responsibility. Why? Because he knows the history. He knows that if capitalism becomes too predatory, if it ignores the human cost for too long, the result is rebellion. The East India Company teaches us that the market is a powerful servant, but a terrible master. John D. Rockefeller wanted to control oil. The East India Company wanted to control everything. They rose from a small office with 5 employees to an empire that ruled 1/5 of the world's population. They showed us the raw, terrifying potential of organized capital. But the question they posed 400 years ago remains unanswered. Who rules the world? The governments we elect, or the companies we buy from? The East India Company may be dead, but its children are alive and well, and they are bigger than ever.